Iran has been US enemy for more than 40 years, since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, where the new leader Ayatollah Khomeini declared the US and Israel as a common enemy all Muslims should unite to fight. The US fights its enemies head-on. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, the US has never shied away from war. The US usually knocks off its enemies with a direct war. But in spite of almost 40 years, the US has refrained from going to war directly with Iran. What could be the reason? Israel, as everybody knows, has been fighting for its existence right from its birth. Israel's neighbors consider Israel to be an occupying army that needs to be evicted by force. Israel, on the other hand, has smartly dealt with the situation. From time to time, with backing from its allies, it has managed to neutralize all kinds of threat from its neighbors. Since its creation in 1948, Israel has fought 8 major wars with its neighboring Arab countries. In addition to wars, Israel has also bombed nuclear enrichment facilities in Iraq and Syria. However, Israel has not attacked Iran directly till now, not even its nuclear enrichment facilities. The US might be a superpower, but it is also a democratic country. The US cannot declare war just like that. The politicians carefully weigh the public sentiment before going to war. Now this is complicated, but will be explained in detail. First, let's take the Vietnam War. The US went to war with Vietnam when the Communist North invaded the Democratic South. The US politicians reasoned that if South Vietnam falls, the rest of South Asia will also come under Communist rule. They call this domino effect. The Vietnam War was by far the most disastrous and costliest war the US has waged. The Vietnam War was so demanding that the US civilian men in the age group of 18 to 26 were forced to be drafted into the war. Even the famous boxer Muhammad Ali in 1966 received the draft notice. He refused. The American government then stripped him of all boxing titles and slapped a 5 years prison sentence for being guilty of the draft. He, however, pleaded in the Supreme Court and stayed out of prison. By 1969, the anti-war sentiments grew exponentially and the public anger began to boil. The US government, expecting a public unrest, cautiously took the decision to pull the troops out of Vietnam. This greatly demoralized the US armed forces. A combination of a long and disastrous war coupled with compulsory conscription and military disobedience brought about something called the Vietnam Syndrome. The Vietnam Syndrome is a term in the US politics that refers to public aversion to American overseas military involvements. In simple terms, it is a maximum limit the US public will tolerate in waging a war overseas. In the Gulf War in 2003, the US troops invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein. If you compare the stats of these two wars, one would see an amazing transition. The US war casualties in the Vietnam War was 58,220. The same in Iraq War was just 4,410. That's a 92.5% decrease. If you see the war timeline, the Vietnam War lasted for 20 years. The same Iraq War lasted for just 20 days. That's a 99% decrease. The stats show how efficient the US war machine has become. But how did the US Army change so much? Well, in the Vietnam War, the US plunged into conflict without any planning or foresight. Moreover, the US greatly underestimated the North Vietnamese and their allies' ability to wage war. On the other side, the Iraq War was well planned and executed. First, the US put Iraq under international sanctions for 10 years from 1991 to 2002. During this time, Iraq could only sell its oil for food. These 10 years made most of the Iraqi weapons completely outdated. With regard to Israel, it is a country fighting for its survival. It is believed Israel has developed nuclear weapons and has around 80 to 400 nuclear warheads. Israel follows the Begin Doctrine, that is, it will attack any hostile neighboring country from acquiring nuclear weapons. Israel showed its ambition to survive under any circumstances by bombing Iraq in 1981. By 1980, Israel had credible information that Iraq was developing nuclear weapons with its reactor called Osirak, built by the French at Tuwaitha Nuclear Research Center, located 17 kilometers southeast of Baghdad. On 7 June 1981, 8 F-16A fighter aircrafts and 6 F-15As carrying Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs pounded the Osirak nuclear facility with 16 bombs. After this, the jets quickly hurried back to Israeli airspace. Of the 16 bombs, 8 of them hit their target. Israel also bombed a suspected Syrian nuclear complex in 2007. Israel's armed forces is one of the most modernized forces with all the latest weapons. Iran knows it cannot match the military might of the US, but it also knows about the Vietnam syndrome, the Achilles heel of the US politicians. As for Israel, it has too small resources to invade Iran on its own. So for US and Israel, there appears to be two options. First, to conduct surgical strikes on Iran's nuclear sites. 2. All-out war to invade and effect a regime change. There are many hurdles for Israel to conduct surgical airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. First, unlike Iraq and Syria, which had only one nuclear facility, Iran has many such sites spread over a wide geography. Secondly, Iran is further away from Israel than Iraq. Israel can possibly take 3 routes to attack. The first is a roundabout route through Turkey, which is doubtful if Turkey would allow that. Second, a straight route through Jordan and Iraq, which is highly unlikely without being detected. The third route is the old route, which is through Saudi Arabia, but this may also not materialize because the Saudis now have powerful radar sites and are more vigilant. All-out war with Iran would invariably be long and disastrous like that of the Vietnam War, mainly due to the geography of Iran. Unlike Iraq, which is flat, Iran's geography contains mountain ranges and deserts. If US and Israel were to invade Iran and capture Tehran, they would require a force of at least 500,000 soldiers. Iran has a standing army of 350,000. If Iran is to use their geography and distribute their forces wisely, they would easily be able to mount huge losses on the Allied invasion force. If the US is to face a long drawn-out war with high casualties, it would invoke the Vietnam syndrome and would be a costly failure. So to conclude, the US and Israel will have to think and rethink on whether they have the resources and the public support to wage a war with Iran. Iran, meanwhile, would do all it takes to avoid another bloody war with any other nation for that matter. Please type in your comments on what you think about this video, and thanks for watching.